This marriage is only an arrangement. Duke Theron Cresswell spoke the words without lowering his voice, without glancing sideways, without any awareness that his wife stood 3 steps behind him, close enough to feel each syllable settle against her skin like frost on glass. The grand dining hall of Cresswell Manor blazed with candlelight that evening. 200 flames trembled inside crystal chandeliers, suspended from painted ceilings, while the scent of roasted venison, buttered parsnips, and wine-soaked pears drifted between long tables draped in ivory linen. Silver platters reflected the faces of 40 distinguished guests, each one dressed in silk and velvet and ambition. Lord Pemberton had asked the question casually enough, swirling cognac inside his glass while watching the young Duchess arrange fresh napkins near the far end of the table. "Your wife seems remarkably composed for someone so new to society at this level." Theron barely paused. "This marriage is only an arrangement, nothing more. She understands the terms." Soft laughter rippled through the nearby gentlemen. Across the table, Lady Oriel Cresswell, the Duke's younger sister, tilted her wineglass with a satisfied smile that caught the candlelight. "You must forgive my brother Lord Pemberton. He married out of obligation, not affection. The poor creature was practically delivered to us like furniture." More laughter followed, louder this time. Evelina Cresswell stood perfectly still beside the mahogany sideboard, her fingers resting against a crystal decanter she had been about to pour. Heat flooded painfully beneath her chest while the laughter continued spreading across the room. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only entertained people who enjoyed watching others break. Instead, she set the decanter down quietly. Then she turned toward the dining hall without expression, looked directly at her husband for the first time that evening, and held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Theron stopped mid-conversation. Something unreadable moved across her expression, something he had never seen before in the months since their wedding. Then Evelina turned and walked out of the room without a single word. The dining hall fell strangely silent. Guests exchanged glances. Oriel's smile faded slightly. Even Lord Pemberton looked uncomfortable, but the Duke simply stared at the doorway where his wife had disappeared. And for reasons he could not explain, the silence she left behind pressed harder against his chest than any room filled with voices ever had. That silence would follow him for months. It would fill corridors, settle into empty chairs, and echo through grand rooms long after the candles had burned down to nothing. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and unexpected love, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories every single day. Now, let us return to where everything began. Months earlier, Evelina Pembury had arrived at Cresswell Manor on a gray Tuesday morning in early November, seated inside a borrowed carriage that smelled of damp leather and lavender oil meant to disguise the age of the cushions. Rain fell steadily across the Northumberland countryside, while the enormous estate appeared slowly through the fog. Cresswell Manor rose from the hills like something carved from storm clouds. Dark stone towers, endless rows of arched windows, slate rooftops stretching in every direction, and gardens so vast they disappeared into the mist before reaching their edges. It was the kind of home built to remind visitors they did not belong. Evelina pressed her gloved hands together in her lap and watched the gates approach. She wore a pale gray traveling dress, modest and carefully mended near the cuffs where the fabric had worn thin. Her dark hair was pinned simply beneath the bonnet she had owned for 4 years. She carried no jewels, no trunks of imported gowns, no dowry worth celebrating. She carried only herself, and a signed contract folded inside her father's leather case. The marriage had been arranged 6 weeks earlier inside a London solicitor's office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old ink. Lord Gareth Pembury, her father, had accumulated debts so catastrophic that 3 estates had already been seized and 2 family portraits sold at auction to repay creditors. The Pembury name, once respected across the southern counties, had become something people whispered about with second-hand embarrassment. Theron Cresswell needed none of the Pembury fortune. He needed something far simpler: a wife. His late father's will contained a clause requiring marriage before the Duke's 35th birthday in order to retain full control of the Cresswell shipping empire without a bride. Controlling shares would transfer to a board of trustees Theron neither liked nor trusted. The arrangement suited both families. Lord Pembury received enough money to silence his most dangerous creditors. Theron received a legal wife without the complication of courtship or emotional attachment. Avelina received nothing except a new name and a house full of strangers who had already decided she was beneath them. The carriage stopped before the manor entrance, where a line of servants waited in pressed black uniforms, their expressions carefully neutral. Avelina stepped onto the wet gravel and looked up at the enormous facade above her. Rain streamed down the dark stone walls, while gargoyles stared from the rooftop edges with hollow eyes. Nobody came forward to greet her personally. After several long seconds, the head housekeeper, a tall woman named Mrs. Corwin, with silver hair pinned beneath a starched cap, stepped forward and curtsied stiffly. "Welcome to Cresswell Manor, Your Grace. Your rooms have been prepared in the East Wing." The East Wing. Avelina would later discover that the Duke's private chambers occupied the West Wing, separated from hers by 200 feet of corridor, a locked library, and what felt like an ocean of deliberate distance. Their wedding had taken place 3 days earlier inside a small chapel in London with no flowers, no music, and fewer than 8 witnesses. Theron had spoken his vows with the flat efficiency of a man signing a shipping manifest. He had not looked at her face once during the ceremony. Afterward, he had excused himself for business meetings and departed before the ink had dried on the marriage register. They had not spoken since. Inside the manor, Avelina quickly discovered the architecture of her new life. Breakfast was served to the Duke in his private study at 7 each morning. Avelina ate alone in the smaller dining room, where a single-place setting waited on a table built for 20 dinner, followed the same pattern. If Theron appeared at all, he sat at the far end of the grand table, reading correspondence between courses without looking up. Conversation between them rarely exceeded a few words. "Good evening, Your Grace." "Good evening." He addressed her with the same polite distance he offered visiting merchants. No warmth, no cruelty, simply the absence of anything at all. Auriel made her feelings considerably clearer. The Duke's younger sister had lived at Cresswell Manor since childhood and treated the estate as her personal kingdom. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way that expensive tailoring and constant mirrors produce. Her gowns arrived monthly from Paris. Her opinions arrived more frequently and with greater force. She studied Avelina during their first dinner, together with the curiosity of someone examining a stain on expensive upholstery. "That dress? Is it new?" Avelina smoothed the fabric across her lap. It was the finest gown she owned, a deep blue silk she had saved for important occasions. "It is not recent?" "No," Auriel smiled at her plate. "How refreshing. Most women entering this family arrive desperate to impress. You seem to have skipped that step entirely." 2 footmen exchanged a glance near the doorway, but kept their silence. Within weeks, the household settled into a pattern that placed Avelina somewhere between guest and ghost. She was technically the Duchess of Cresswell, mistress of one of the grandest estates in England. In practice, she occupied rooms nobody visited, walked corridors nobody noticed, and ate meals nobody shared. Yet the manor itself needed constant attention that nobody else seemed willing to provide. Corwin managed the indoor servants efficiently, but decisions beyond daily routine had no clear authority behind them since the late Duchess had passed years earlier, and Auriel concerned herself only with her own social calendar. Avelina began filling the gaps quietly. She noticed the East Wing linens had not been replaced in months and arranged fresh ones without being asked. She observed that kitchen deliveries arrived inconsistently and reorganized the accounts with the cook until supplies became reliable. When 3 housemaids fell ill during the same week, Avelina personally carried firewood to guest rooms and polished silver beside the remaining staff without complaint. Nobody asked her to do any of it. Nobody thanked her when she did. One gray afternoon, she was adjusting winter curtains in the second-floor gallery when Theron passed through on his way to the study. He paused briefly, noticing her standing on a small stepladder with pins between her teeth, fabric draped across her arms. He watched her for several seconds in silence. Something flickered behind his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like confusion, as though the sight of his wife performing household tasks did not fit neatly inside any category he had prepared for her. Then he continued walking without a word. That evening, during a small dinner attended by 3 visiting business associates, one of the gentlemen turned toward Avelina with polite curiosity. "Your Grace, this roasted partridge is extraordinary. You must have a remarkable cook." Before Avelina could respond, Oriel interrupted smoothly from across the table. "The household manages itself beautifully, Mr. Halford. My brother built an exceptional staff long before any recent arrivals." The gentleman nodded and returned to his plate. Avelina lowered her eyes and continued eating in silence. She had personally spent 2 hours that morning reviewing the menu with the cook, selecting the herbs from the kitchen garden herself, and ensuring the partridge was prepared with a rosemary glaze she remembered from her mother's recipe. Nobody at the table knew. Nobody at the table would have cared. Later that night, Avelina sat alone inside her bedroom in the east wing, brushing her hair before a small mirror while rain hammered against the windows. The fire crackled softly inside the stone hearth while shadows stretched across the ceiling. From somewhere deep inside the west wing, she heard the faint sound of a piano playing. Slow, melancholy notes that drifted through the corridors like smoke. She had learned from the servants that Theron played late at night when he could not sleep, always alone. Always the same dark, wandering compositions that seemed to carry something heavier than music. Avelina set down her brush and listened until the notes eventually stopped. Then silence returned. The kind of silence that did not feel empty, but full. Full of distance. Full of things unspoken. Full of 2 people living inside the same enormous house, while somehow never occupying the same room. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stared at the rain-streaked window. Somewhere beyond the glass, the moors stretched endlessly into darkness. Winter arrived at Cresswell Manor with bitter winds that howled across the Northumberland moors and rattled every window in the east wing. Frost covered the gardens each morning like shattered crystal, while the sky remained a permanent shade of iron gray from November through February. Inside the manor, fires burned constantly in every occupied room, and servants moved quickly through drafty corridors carrying wood, blankets, and trays of hot broth. The estate employed over 60 household workers, groundskeepers, stable hands, and kitchen staff, most of whom had served the Cresswell family for years. They noticed the new Duchess before anyone else did. It began with small things. Brinley, a young kitchen maid, who had worked at the manor since she was 14, burned her wrist badly one morning while lifting a pot of boiling stock from the stove. The cook shouted at her for carelessness while 2 other maids stepped away quickly, unwilling to involve themselves in trouble. Avelina happened to be passing through the kitchen corridor carrying a stack of mending she had collected from the housekeeper's room. She heard the girl crying and entered without hesitation. "Let me see." Brinley tried to hide her arm behind her apron, frightened of causing problems for herself. Avelina gently took her wrist and examined the angry red burns spreading across the skin. "This needs cold water and a clean dressing. Come with me." She led the trembling girl into the still room beside the pantry, soaked a linen cloth in cold water, and wrapped the burn carefully while speaking in a voice soft enough to calm the panic shaking through the girl's hands. "You are not in trouble. Burns happen in kitchens. The important thing is that we treat it properly so it heals without scarring." Brinley stared at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. No one of the Duchess's standing had ever touched a servant's injury personally, let alone sat beside her on a wooden stool in the still room while carefully tying a bandage. "Thank you, Your Grace." Avelina smiled gently. "What is your name?" "Brinley, Your Grace." "Brinley, how long have you worked here?" "Since I was 14, Your Grace, nearly 5 years now." Avelina nodded and squeezed the girl's uninjured hand before standing. "If that burn worsens, you come to me directly, not the cook." Me, the girl nodded quickly, emotion tightening visibly across her young face. After Avelina left, Brinley sat alone in the still room for several minutes, staring at the carefully wrapped bandage around her wrist. Nobody had told her to find the Duchess. Nobody had sent Avelina into the kitchen. She had simply heard someone in pain and walked toward it. Word spread quietly among the servants within days. The groundskeeper's eldest son, a boy of 12, named Fen, had been struggling to read since arriving at the manor with his father 2 years earlier. He hid the difficulty carefully, terrified of losing his position if anyone discovered he could not understand the written instructions left for outdoor workers each morning. Avelina discovered him one afternoon, crouched behind the garden shed, squinting desperately at a note pinned to the supply list. She watched him for a moment from the pathway before approaching. "Would you like some help with that?" Fen flushed scarlet and crumpled the paper behind his back. "I can manage, Your Grace." Avelina sat on the stone bench beside the shed without any ceremony, her dark wool dress collecting dust from the surface. She did not take the note from him, she did not lecture him, she simply waited. After a long silence, the boy slowly handed the paper forward with trembling fingers. Avelina read it aloud, pointing to each word carefully while explaining the sounds. Then she asked him to try. When he stumbled, she corrected him patiently without any trace of frustration. When he succeeded, she nodded with quiet encouragement that carried more weight than applause. From that afternoon, Avelina spent 30 minutes each day teaching Fen to read inside the back kitchen when his duties allowed. She used labels from food jars, seed packets from the greenhouse, and pages torn from old almanacs nobody missed. She told no one. Meanwhile, the Dowager Duchess, Seraphine Cresswell, observed everything from a careful distance. Theron's mother had retired to the Manor's south apartments after her husband's death, and rarely involved herself in household matters, but she watched. She watched her son bury himself deeper into business papers each week. She watched Oriel sharpen her tongue against a woman who never fought back, and she watched the new Duchess move through the estate like someone tending a garden nobody had asked her to plant. One afternoon, Seraphine passed the second-floor linen room and noticed Evelina sitting cross-legged on the floor beside old Mrs. Hadley, the elderly seamstress who had served the manor for over 30 years. Hadley's eyesight had been failing for months, and her stitching had begun to wander. Rather than report the problem to Mrs. Corwin, which would almost certainly cost the old woman her position, Evelina had been quietly completing the most difficult repairs herself, while sitting beside Mrs. Hadley, and letting the woman believe she was still managing perfectly. Seraphine stood in the doorway unseen, watching the young Duchess thread a needle with steady fingers while laughing softly at something the old seamstress had whispered. The Dowager said nothing. But something shifted behind her expression. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition that evening. Seraphine joined Theron in his study, something she rarely did without reason. He sat behind his enormous desk, surrounded by shipping ledgers and half-finished letters, a glass of whiskey untouched beside his right hand. "Your wife spent the afternoon mending linens beside Mrs. Hadley." Theron did not look up. "She is free to occupy herself however she chooses." Seraphine studied her son's face carefully. The same hard lines had deepened around his jaw over the past year. The same deliberate blankness filled his eyes whenever Avelina's name entered conversation. "You chose her because she asked for nothing? I chose her because the arrangement required a wife. Nothing more." Seraphine paused near the doorway. "Be careful, Theron. The women who ask for nothing are often the ones giving everything, and you rarely notice until they stop." Theron's pen hesitated briefly above the page. Then he continued writing, pretending his mother had said nothing at all. But later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, he stood at the window of his study overlooking the darkened gardens below. Through the frost-covered glass, a faint glow moved slowly along the ground-floor corridor. Avelina, carrying a candle, walking the halls alone at midnight again. He watched until the light disappeared around the far corner of the east wing. Then he turned back to his empty room and poured the whiskey he had been ignoring all evening. 3 months into the marriage. Lord Gareth Pembury arrived at Cresswell Manor unannounced on a cold December afternoon. His carriage rolled through the iron gates, trailing mud across the freshly gravelled drive, while two exhausted horses steamed in the freezing air. Evelina saw the carriage from the second-floor gallery window and felt her stomach tighten immediately. Her father never visited without reason, and his reasons were never kind. She descended the staircase quickly, hoping to greet him before Oriel's sharp observations turned his arrival into entertainment. But Lord Pembury had already been directed to the Duke's private study by Mrs. Corwin, and the heavy oak door was closed by the time Evelina reached the corridor. She stood outside for a moment, uncertain whether to knock. Then she heard her father's voice through the door, and something in his tone made her stop completely. "The arrangement has exceeded my expectations, Your Grace. Truly, I must commend your generosity. The creditors in Shropshire have been satisfied entirely, and I have begun discussions to recover the Linfield property." Theron's reply was measured and flat. The terms were clear. "Lord Pembury, I have honored every clause, and you have my deepest gratitude." Gareth's voice carried the false warmth of a man who had spent decades flattering people wealthier than himself. "I confess I worried initially that Evelina might prove difficult. She has a stubborn quality that surfaces occasionally, but it seems marriage has settled her considerably." A brief silence followed. "She has caused no difficulty," Theron said carefully. Gareth laughed softly. "Good. She was always the quietest of my children, which I suppose made her the easiest to place. Her sisters would have demanded far more attention." Evelina pressed her back against the corridor wall. The stone felt cold through her dress while her father's words carved something open inside her chest. The easiest to place, as though she were livestock guided into the most convenient pen. As though her quietness, her willingness to endure without complaint, had simply made her the most disposable daughter in a desperate man's calculation. Gareth continued, his tone shifting into something that reminded Evelina of a man reviewing inventory rather than discussing his eldest daughter. "I must say she has always been remarkably low maintenance. Even as a child, she required very little attention compared to the others. I sometimes wonder if that quality made things easier for everyone, or simply made her easier to forget." "And the duration clause?" "It remains unchanged." Theron paused before answering. "The marriage must remain intact for a minimum of 2 years to satisfy the inheritance provision. After that, legal separation becomes possible if both parties agree to terms." 2 years. Evelina's fingers curled slowly against the cold stone. She had never seen the full contract. Her father had placed the papers before her in the solicitor's office and pointed to the signature line without explanation. She had signed because refusing meant watching her younger sisters lose their home entirely. Now she understood the architecture of the arrangement completely. She was not a wife. She was a clause with a heartbeat. A temporary presence designed to satisfy legal language and then quietly disappear when the terms expired. Garrett's chair scraped against the floor. "Excellent. Well, I shall not overstay my welcome. I trust you will continue managing her appropriately." "She is not a horse, Lord Pembury." The words came from Theron so unexpectedly that silence filled the study for several seconds. Even through the closed door, Evelina felt the shift in temperature. Gareth recovered quickly, with another polished laugh. "Of course, merely an expression. I meant no disrespect." Footsteps approached the door. Evelina moved quickly down the corridor and turned the corner before it opened. She pressed herself against the wall and waited until her father's boots echoed past toward the entrance hall, followed by the quieter, heavier steps of the Duke walking in the opposite direction. Neither man saw her standing in the shadows that evening. Evelina sat alone in her bedroom and stared at the candle flame on her nightstand, until the wax pooled and spilled across the brass holder. She did not cry. Tears had stopped solving anything years ago. Instead, she pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed slowly until the trembling stopped. 2 years. She could survive 2 years. She had survived worse. But somewhere beneath the composure she wore like armor, something cracked that evening. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet fracture, running through the last remaining part of her, that had hoped this life might become something more than a sentence she was serving for her father's failures. January brought the announcement that Auriel Cresswell had become engaged to the Marquess of Haverford, a man of enormous wealth and political importance, whose family name alone could silence entire rooms at London dinner parties. The news arrived like a storm that swallowed everything inside Cresswell Manor for weeks. Preparations consumed the household almost overnight. Dressmakers arrived from London carrying bolts of champagne-colored silk and ivory lace. Florists delivered crates of hothouse roses that perfumed the entire ground floor so heavily that servants complained of headaches by the second day. A French pastry chef was hired specifically for the engagement dinner, arriving with copper molds, 3 assistants, and the kind of temperament that made everyone in the kitchen afraid to breathe too loudly. Auriel moved through the manor like a woman who believed the world had finally confirmed what she had always known about herself. Every conversation revolved around her. Every decision required her approval. Every mirror she passed received her full attention. The engagement dinner was planned for the last Saturday of January, and invitations were sent to over 100 guests across 3 counties. Nobody discussed any of this with Avelina. Yet within days the weight of the preparations landed almost entirely on her shoulders. Not through any formal request. Simply through the slow, familiar process of tasks being abandoned by everyone else, until she was the only person still holding them. Auriel refused to discuss seating arrangements, insisting they bored her. The cook argued daily with the French pastry chef over kitchen territory, until Avelina mediated a compromise involving separate preparation schedules and divided counter space. Corwin fell ill with a winter chest infection and spent 4 days confined to her room, leaving Avelina to supervise the housemaids, footmen, and extra staff hired for the event. She counted silverware, she inspected guest bedrooms. She resolved a dispute between the florist and the groundskeeper about which entrance would receive the largest flower arrangements. She tasted every course 2 days before the dinner and quietly adjusted seasoning on the pheasant consommé. After realizing the French chef had oversalted it badly by the morning of the celebration, Avelina had slept fewer than 4 hours. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, while exhaustion settled into her bones like something permanent. Her fingers ached from pinning fabric samples, writing, place cards, and carrying stacked china between rooms, because 2 footmen had been reassigned to polish the ballroom floor. Nobody thanked her. Nobody acknowledged a single task she had completed. Auriel swept into the drawing room that afternoon, wearing a gown of pale gold silk that shimmered with every movement. Diamond pins held her hair in an elaborate arrangement that had taken her maid nearly 2 hours to complete. She looked magnificent, and knew it completely. As she passed Avelina in the corridor, she paused just long enough to glance at the Duchess's plain dark green dress. "You're not wearing that tonight, surely?" Avelina looked down at her dress. It was clean, well-fitted, and the finest she had available. I had not planned otherwise. Auriel sighed with theatrical exhaustion. "Theron, darling," she called toward the study doorway. "Your wife intends to attend my engagement dinner, dressed like a governess from inside the study." Theron's voice carried flatly. "She may wear whatever she likes." Auriel. Auriel shrugged with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. Of course, we cannot all be expected to rise to every occasion that afternoon. While adjusting centerpieces in the ballroom, Avelina overheard 2 visiting ladies speaking near the corridor entrance. Their voices carried with the carelessness of women who assume servants were the only ones listening. "I hear the Duke's wife was practically purchased," one murmured behind her fan. "Her father owed money to half the creditors in London." The other woman laughed softly, "And now she arranges flowers for her sister-in-law's celebration." How perfectly humbling. Avelina's hands steadied themselves against the vase before her. She adjusted the last rose, stepped back to check the arrangement, and walked calmly toward the kitchen without acknowledging either woman. Inside her chest, something familiar tightened and held. She had been hearing whispers like these for months, in church pews, at village shops, during morning walks along the estate grounds. Society had already written her story, before she had spoken a single word in her own defense. The impoverished bride, the convenient wife, the woman nobody envied and everyone pitied. The worst part was not the cruelty itself. The worst part was how unsurprised she felt each time it arrived. By evening, the manor blazed with light and noise and the heavy sweetness of expensive perfume, mixing with roasted meats and melted candle wax. Carriages lined the front drive while guests in furs and jewels streamed through the entrance hall, handing coats and gloves to footmen before drifting toward the ballroom. The French chef's desserts towered at the center of the dining table. Spun sugar roses surrounded layered cakes filled with raspberry cream, while chocolate truffles dusted with gold leaf rested on silver trays beside crystal bowls of sugared almonds. Platters of roasted lamb, herb-crusted salmon, braised root, vegetables glazed with honey, and fresh bread rolls still warm from the ovens covered every surface. Auriel held court beside the Marquess of Haverford, a tall, pleasant man named Dryston, who seemed genuinely fond of her despite everything. Guests surrounded them constantly, offering congratulations and admiring the enormous sapphire ring glittering on Auriel's finger. Avelina moved quietly between rooms, ensuring wine glasses stayed full, redirecting confused servants and catching a platter of oysters that a nervous footman nearly dropped near the ballroom entrance. Nobody noticed her catch it. Several people noticed the footman stumble. During dinner, Evelina sat at the far end of the table, separated from the Duke by 11 guests on each side. The distance felt deliberate, though she could not say who had arranged the seating. Auriel, probably midway through the second course, Lady Pemberton turned toward Evelina with polite curiosity. "You have done remarkable work with the arrangements this evening, Your Grace?" Before Evelina could respond, Auriel's voice carried clearly from the head of the table. "Oh, Mrs. Corwin managed everything beautifully despite her illness. The staff here are simply exceptional." Several guests nodded approvingly. Evelina lowered her fork and said nothing. Later, during dessert, the Marquess of Haverford raised his glass toward the table. "To the Cresswell family," he announced warmly, "for welcoming me so generously into their extraordinary household." Auriel lifted her glass with radiant confidence. "And to my dear brother, who made all of this possible." Glasses rose across the table. Theron nodded briefly from his chair. Nobody raised a glass to Abelina. Nobody mentioned the woman who had spent 3 weeks ensuring every flower, every napkin, every plate, and every candle was placed precisely where it needed to be. After the toast, an elderly countess seated nearby leaned toward Avelina with a smile that carried more pity than kindness. "You must feel so proud watching your sister-in-law's happiness, my dear. Perhaps your own time for celebration will come eventually." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Avelina smiled politely and excused herself from the table. She walked through the servants' corridor behind the kitchen, away from the music and laughter. As she passed the pantry entrance, she nearly collided with Brinley, who was carrying a tray of clean glasses toward the ballroom. "Your Grace." Brinley stopped immediately, concern flooding her young face. "Are you well?" Avelina forced a small smile. "Perfectly well, just catching my breath." Brinley hesitated, clearly unconvinced. Then she set the tray down on the nearest shelf and spoke quietly. "You organized all of this, Your Grace. Every person in that room is eating food. You selected, sitting in chairs you arranged, drinking from glasses you counted by hand. I watched you do it." Evelina stared at the girl. The simple honesty in those words landed harder than any insult she had absorbed that evening. Brinley picked up her tray again. "They should know," she added softly. Then she continued toward the ballroom. Avelina stood alone in the corridor for a moment, before continuing until she reached the cold still room at the back of the manor. She stood alone in the dim, quiet space and placed her hands flat on the stone chemtop while her breathing steadied through the wall. She could hear muffled applause as someone proposed another toast inside the ballroom. She stayed in the still room for nearly 10 minutes before smoothing her dress, straightening her posture, and walking back into the celebration wearing the same composed expression she had carried since the day she arrived at Cresswell Manor. Nobody noticed she had been gone later that night. Long after the last carriage had rolled through the gates and the servants had begun clearing plates, Avelina climbed the east wing staircase alone. Her feet ached. Her hands smelled of candle wax and silver polish. Exhaustion squeezed her temples until her vision blurred. As she reached the top of the stairs, she passed the second-floor landing where a tall window overlooked the ballroom below. Through the glass, she saw Theron standing alone in the empty room, his hands resting on the back of a chair, while he stared at the place where she had been sitting during dinner. He stood there for a long time. Avelina watched him for a moment, then turned away and continued to her room without a sound. Avelina Pembury had not always been quiet. At 17, she moved through the Pembury estate in Wiltshire with the kind of energy that made rooms feel brighter simply because she had entered them. She laughed openly during dinners, debated politics with her father's guests until they turned red with surprise, and played the cello in the music room each evening with a devotion that drew servants to linger outside the door, pretending to dust surfaces that were already clean. She read constantly. Poetry, philosophy, natural history, novels in French that she translated aloud to her younger sisters while they braided each other's hair beside the fireplace. Her governess, a sharp and fiercely intelligent woman named Miss Hartigan, had spent years cultivating Evelina's curiosity until it burned like a steady flame behind her eyes. "You have a mind that most men would envy, and most women are taught to hide," Miss Hartigan told her once during a Latin lesson. "Never let anyone convince you that silence is the same as wisdom. Sometimes silence is simply surrender, dressed in better clothes." Avelina carried those words like armor through her adolescence. Then Emery Voss arrived. He came to the Pembury estate as a tutor for Avelina's younger brother, hired through a university connection that Lord Pembury barely remembered approving. Emery was 23, thin-faced, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone whose wealth existed entirely inside his mind rather than his inheritance. He noticed Avelina before she noticed him. During his first week, he overheard her arguing passionately with a visiting clergyman about the morality of land enclosure, while her sisters giggled uncomfortably in the background. Most men would have been intimidated or dismissive. Emery simply waited until the clergyman departed and approached her beside the garden wall. "You were right, by the way, about the enclosure acts, though your argument about tenant displacement would be stronger if you referenced the Speenhamlin reports." Avelina stared at him. Nobody had ever responded to one of her opinions with a better source. Their friendship deepened across months like roots spreading beneath visible ground. They exchanged books through the library, leaving notes tucked inside covers for each other to find. They debated history during walks through the orchard, while autumn turned the leaves, copper and gold, around them. He played guitar softly in the evenings while she accompanied him on cello, their music weaving together through the open windows until darkness swallowed the gardens outside. For the first time in her life, Avelina felt entirely seen. Not admired for beauty or evaluated for marriage, potential, simply known, understood in the specific, irreplaceable way that happens when someone pays attention to who you actually are, instead of who they need you to be, Miss Hartigan noticed immediately. "Be careful," she warned gently one afternoon. "Your father watches everything through the lens of utility. If this young man cannot increase the family's position, your father will remove him without hesitation." Avelina believed love was stronger than calculation. She was 19. She had not yet learned how wrong that belief could be. Lord Pembury discovered the relationship on a warm evening in late September when he returned unexpectedly from London and found Emery and Avelina sitting together beneath the willow tree near the lake. They were not touching. They were simply talking, leaning toward each other with the unconscious intimacy of two people whose thoughts had become inseparable. The explosion came that night behind the closed doors of the study. Lord Pembury's voice shook the walls with a fury that sent servants retreating to the furthest corners of the house. "A tutor! You have attached yourself to a penniless tutor while I am negotiating your introduction to Lord Hathersage's son. Do you understand what you have cost this family?" Avelina stood her ground. "Emery is a good man, father. His circumstances do not diminish his character. Character does not pay debts, Gareth shouted. Character does not restore estates. Character does not prevent this family from being destroyed by creditors who care nothing for your romantic delusions. He dismissed Emery the following morning. The young tutor was given 30 minutes to pack his belongings and escorted from the property by 2 groundsmen, while Avelina was confined to her bedroom by direct order. She called out through the door, pleading for someone to let her say goodbye. She knocked desperately until her hands ached against the heavy wood, her voice breaking with every word that went unanswered. Nobody came. When she was finally released, the following day, Emery was gone. A letter had been left for her with Miss Hartigan, but Lord Pembury had intercepted and destroyed it before it could be delivered. Avelina never learned what Emery had written. For weeks afterward, she wrote letters of her own and attempted to send them through servants willing to help. Every letter was intercepted, every sympathetic servant was quietly dismissed. The channels between Avelina and the outside world closed one by one until she existed in a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Then the final blow arrived. 3 months after Emery's departure, Miss Hartigan was dismissed without warning. Lord Pembury offered no explanation beyond a cold statement that the governess was no longer required. Avelina found out from a housemaid who had overheard the conversation. Miss Hartigan had confronted Lord Pembury privately, accusing him of cruelty toward his own daughter. She had called him a man who measured his children's worth in currency rather than character. Gareth removed her from the estate within the hour. The loss of Miss Hartigan broke something inside Avelina that Emery's departure had only cracked. The governess had been the one person in the household who had ever told Avelina that her voice mattered, that her thoughts held value. That silence was not something to aspire toward, but something imposed by people afraid of what she might say. Without Miss Hartigan, without Emery, without any remaining ally inside the walls of her own home, Avelina slowly stopped speaking and less spoken to. She stopped debating at dinner. She stopped playing the cello. She stopped reading aloud to her sisters, who had already begun distancing themselves from someone their father clearly considered damaged goods. By 20, the passionate, curious, fierce young woman who had once argued with clergymen and translated French poetry beside the fireplace had disappeared so completely that visitors to the Pembury estate sometimes forgot Lord Pembury had a third daughter at all. Silence became her only safe place, not because she had nothing to say, but because everything she had ever said had been used to take something away from her. And now, 12 years later, standing inside a marriage built on paper and legal clauses, Avelina carried that same silence through the corridors of Cresswell Manor like a wound she had learned to carry so carefully that nobody could see it had never fully healed. Theron Cresswell had not always been made of stone. At 22, before the title, before the shipping empire, before the silence that followed him through every corridor of Cresswell Manor, he had been the kind of man who laughed during dinner and stayed up past midnight arguing about philosophy with anyone willing to match him. His father, the late Duke Aldous Cresswell, had raised him with the belief that strength and warmth were not opposites. The old Duke had governed his estates with firm authority, but treated his tenants with genuine concern, remembered the names of every servant's child, and spent Sunday afternoons reading beside his wife in the garden, while rain or shine contentment. Theron admired his father more than any man alive. When Aldous died unexpectedly, from a fever that swept through the northern counties during the winter of 1881, Theron inherited not only the estate, but the crushing weight of becoming someone he did not yet know how to be. He was 24 years old, terrified beneath his composure, and suddenly responsible for an empire spanning shipping routes, tenant farms, factories, and political alliances that required decisions he had never been trained to make alone. Grief consumed him privately, publicly. He maintained the appearance of control that society demanded from men of his position. He attended every obligation, signed every document, and sat through every meeting while something inside him ached constantly for the father whose voice no longer echoed through the study. Lady Venetia Darrow appeared during this exact period, arriving like sunlight through a window he had forgotten was open. She was the daughter of a respected baron from Derbyshire, beautiful in the effortless, luminous way that made entire ballrooms rearrange themselves around her presence. Her dark auburn hair caught candlelight like polished copper, and her laughter carried a musical quality that made men forget whatever they had been saying mid-sentence. But what drew Theron was not her beauty. It was how she listened. During their earliest conversations, Venetia gave him something nobody else offered after his father's death: attention without judgment. She asked about his grief openly, without the embarrassed discomfort most people showed when confronted with genuine emotion from a powerful man. She sat beside him during quiet evenings and let him speak about his fears, about the loneliness of inheriting authority too young, about the terror of failing the legacy his father had built. "I have never told anyone these things," Theron confessed one evening beside the library fire, while snow fell beyond the windows. Venetia placed her hand gently over his. "That is because nobody has ever truly asked." He believed her completely. He believed the softness in her voice, and the concern in her eyes, and the quiet patience with which she absorbed every vulnerability he offered. For 12 months, he gave her more of himself than he had given any living person: his private doubts, his unfinished griefs, his fear that the world saw only his title, while the man beneath it slowly disappeared. He purchased a ring. He planned a proposal for spring. Then, during a weekend gathering at Lord Ashton's country estate, everything collapsed. Theron arrived late after business delayed his departure from London. He entered the drawing room expecting to find Venetia, and instead found a circle of guests laughing at a story being told with theatrical flair by Lady Helena Caswell, a notorious gossip whose cruelty was considered entertainment in certain social circles. "The poor man actually wept," Helena announced delightedly while guests leaned closer. Venetia said he sat beside the fire, talking about his dead father like a man confessing to a priest. "Can you imagine the Duke of Cresswell weeping?" Laughter swept through the room. Theron stood frozen in the doorway. Nobody had noticed his arrival. Another guest spoke through barely controlled amusement, and she simply sat there listening. "How did she manage?" Helena waved her hand dismissively. "Venetia has the patience of a saint when the reward is large enough. She told me everything afterward over champagne. Apparently, he fears being unworthy of the estate. The wealthiest duke in northern England frightened of his own inheritance." More laughter. Someone clinked their glass. Theron felt something rupture quietly inside his chest. Not rage, something worse. The realization that every private moment, every whispered confession, every tear he had trusted another human being to hold safely, had been collected like currency and spent freely across drawing rooms for the amusement of strangers. He left the estate wordlessly. The confrontation with Venetia happened 2 days later inside his London townhouse. She arrived wearing pale blue silk, and an expression that seemed genuinely confused by his coldness. "You shared everything I told you," he said quietly. "Every private word, every grief, every fear." Venetia studied him for a long moment. Then something shifted behind her eyes. The softness he had loved dissolved into something harder and far more honest. "Theron, darling, you handed your wounds to a woman you barely knew and expected them to remain sacred. That was your mistake, not mine. Emotions are simply information. You gave yours away too freely, and I used them as anyone in my position would." She adjusted her gloves calmly. "You will recover. Powerful men always do. But perhaps next time, keep your grief where it belongs." Behind closed doors, and far from anyone clever enough to profit from it, she left without a backward glance. Theron stood alone inside the townhouse for a very long time after the door closed. The engagement ring sat inside his coat pocket, pressing against his ribs like a bruise that would never fully surface. He never proposed to anyone again. He never spoke about his father again in private company. He never cried in front of another person. And when his late father's will surfaced the clause requiring marriage before 35, he chose the most transactional arrangement possible: a wife who would expect nothing because he intended to offer nothing. He chose Evelina Pembury precisely because she was quiet, undemanding, and unlikely to reach him. What he had not anticipated was that her silence would prove more unsettling than any words Venetia had ever spoken. February brought the worst storm Northumberland had seen in 15 years. Winds tore across the moors with a violence that stripped tiles from rooftops and drove livestock into desperate shelter behind stone walls. Rain fell sideways for 2 straight days, while the river running through the eastern boundary of the Cresswell estate swelled dangerously toward the tenant cottages clustered along its banks. Theron spent the afternoon in his study, receiving updates from the estate manager, a steady, practical man named Hargrove, who had overseen the grounds for nearly 20 years. The Dunbar family and the Colthorns are closest to the flooding, Hargrove reported. If the river rises another 2 feet overnight, their cottages will be underwater by morning. Theron nodded. Send men to help them relocate temporarily. Use the east barn for shelter. Hargrove hesitated. Most of the outdoor staff have already been sent to secure the livestock buildings, Your Grace. I can spare perhaps 2 men. 2 men would not be enough to move 2 families with children, elderly parents, and whatever possessions they could carry through a storm that was still worsening by the hour before Theron could respond. The study door opened. Evelina stood in the doorway wearing a heavy wool cloak already darkened with rain. Her boots were muddy to the ankle, her hair had pulled loose from its pins and clung to her face in wet strands. Theron stared at her. I have already spoken with Mrs. Corwin, she said calmly. The east barn is being prepared with blankets, firewood, and hot broth. Brinley and 2 kitchen maids are packing food supplies now. I need 4 lanterns, rope, and the flat cart from the stable yard. Hargrove blinked. Your Grace, the storm outside is still. I am aware of the storm, Mr. Hargrove. The Dunbar family has 3 children under the age of 7. Mrs. Colthorn cannot walk without assistance. They will not survive the night if the river reaches their doors. She looked at Theron directly. Something in her gaze held no apology, no hesitation, no request for permission. Simply the steady clarity of someone who had already decided what needed to happen. I will go myself, if no one else is available, she added quietly. The room fell silent. Theron stood slowly from his desk. Hargrove, prepare the cart. I will accompany the Duchess personally. The estate manager looked stunned, but moved immediately. Within 30 minutes, Theron, Evelina, Hargrove, and 2 groundsmen drove through the storm toward the river cottages, with lanterns swaying violently against the wind. The water had already entered the Dunbar cottage when they arrived. Theron carried the 2 youngest children through knee-deep flooding while Evelina helped Mrs. Dunbar wrap the baby in oilskin to protect him from the rain. At the Colthorn cottage, Evelina lifted old Mrs. Colthorn onto the cart herself when the elderly woman's legs buckled on the muddy path. They worked in near darkness, shouting over the wind while rain hammered against their backs. By the time both families were safely inside the east barn, wrapped in blankets beside a roaring fire, with hot broth steaming in their hands, nearly 4 hours had passed. Evelina moved between the families, checking on each person individually. She dried Mrs. Colthorn's hair with a warm cloth. She sang softly to the youngest Dunbar child, until the frightened boy finally stopped crying and fell asleep against her shoulder. She inspected every blanket, every cup, every corner of the barn for drafts before she was satisfied. Theron watched all of this from near the barn entrance. Rain still dripped from his coat and hair. His hands were scraped raw from carrying children through floodwater, but he barely noticed any of it. What he noticed was Evelina, not as a clause in a contract, not as a quiet presence occupying the east wing, not as the invisible woman he had spent months failing to see. He noticed her as the only person in the room who had not waited to be asked. The only person who had heard a crisis unfolding and walked toward it instead of away. The only person who treated tenant families with the same care and urgency that most people reserved exclusively for their own comfort. Something fractured inside his chest, not painfully, more like a wall shifting unexpectedly to reveal a window that had been there all along, hidden behind stone. On the ride back to the manor, through lessening rain, They sat side by side on the cart bench in silence. Neither spoke, but for the first time since their wedding, the silence between them did not feel like distance. It felt like something shared. 3 days later, a dinner was held at a neighboring estate hosted by Lord and Lady Aldingham. 40 guests attended, including several families from London society who had traveled north for the hunting season. Avelina, dressed in her dark green gown, the same one Oriel had mocked weeks earlier, and sat quietly at the far end of the table as usual. Midway through the evening, Lady Aldingham asked Theron about the flooding. "I heard you personally rescued 2 families during the storm, Your Grace. How extraordinarily brave." Theron set down his glass. Guests nearby turned to listen. "I did not rescue anyone, Lady Aldingham. My wife organized the entire effort. She prepared the shelter, gathered the supplies, and insisted on going into the storm herself before I even understood the severity of the situation. Every family saved that night was saved because of the Duchess." Absolute silence fell across the table. Avelina looked up from her plate. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Across the table, Oriel's expression tightened visibly while several guests turned toward Avelina with expressions of genuine surprise. It was the first time Theron had publicly acknowledged her existence as anything more than an arrangement. After dinner, as guests dispersed into the drawing room for coffee and cards, Theron approached Avelina near the window. "You did not need to say that," she said quietly without looking at him. "I said it because it was true." Several seconds of silence passed between them. Outside, a cold wind leaned against the glass while candlelight flickered across both their faces. Then Theron spoke again, and his voice carried something she had never heard from him before, something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "I have not been fair to you, Avelina." Her name. He had used her actual name for the first time since their wedding. She turned toward him slowly. Her eyes glistened faintly beneath the candlelight, though she did not allow the tears to fall. "No," she said softly, "you have not." Then she walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing beside the window with the weight of her honesty pressing against his chest, like something he was not sure he knew how to carry. The shift between Theron and Avelina was barely visible at first. A question asked across the breakfast table where silence had previously reigned. A door held open a moment longer than necessary. A glance during dinner that lasted 2 seconds instead of none. But Oriel noticed immediately she had spent her entire life as the center of Cresswell Manor, the beloved daughter, the social architect. The beautiful, sharp-tongued sister, whose approval servants feared and guests courted. Theron's emotional distance from his wife had confirmed Oriel's position as the most important woman in the household, and she had guarded that position with the instinct of someone who understood exactly how fragile power built on proximity truly was. The moment her brother began speaking Avelina's name instead of referring to her as your wife or the Duchess, something cold settled into Oriel's chest. She began with small provocations. During a Tuesday luncheon attended by 3 neighboring families, Oriel interrupted the conversation between Theron and Avelina about the estate's tenant records with a bright laugh. "Darling brother, surely you are not troubling your wife with business matters. She must find such things terribly dull." Avelina offered no response. Theron glanced at his sister with an expression that held the faintest trace of irritation. "She understands the records better than most of my estate managers, Oriel." The compliment landed publicly. Oriel's smile hardened almost imperceptibly. Within days she escalated. Letters were sent to London, invitations extended. Social debts called upon with the precision of someone who understood exactly which weapons society kept sharpened for occasions like these. Lady Venetia Darrow arrived at Cresswell Manor on a Friday afternoon in early March, stepping from a polished black carriage wearing deep burgundy velvet and an expression of warm familiarity that suggested she had never left. "Theron," she said brightly as she entered the drawing room where tea had been arranged. "How long it has been your sister was kind enough to insist I visit." Theron's face emptied of expression so completely that even the footman standing beside the door noticed. His eyes moved briefly toward Oriel, who sat beside the window with an innocent smile arranged carefully across her face. Lady Darrow, what an unexpected pleasure. The words carried no warmth whatsoever, but Venetia had never required warmth to operate. She required proximity, and Oriel had provided it. Over the following days, Venetia settled into Cresswell Manor like ivy growing across stonework. She appeared at every meal. She joined every gathering. She positioned herself beside Theron during conversations with practiced ease, laughing at his remarks, referencing shared memories, and touching his arm with a familiarity that implied history Evelina could not compete with. Evelina watched quietly. She raised no objection to Venetia's presence, asked no questions about their past, and made no attempt to compete for attention she had never been offered willingly. But something changed inside her. A careful withdrawal that Theron was only beginning to notice the questions she had started asking at breakfast disappeared again. The door she had begun leaving slightly open between their corridors closed once more. The faint warmth that had started entering her voice when she spoke to him retreated like a tide pulling back from shore. Venetia noticed it too, and she pressed harder. During a dinner attended by several important guests, Venetia leaned toward Theron with practiced familiarity and spoke loudly enough for the table to hear. "Do you remember that evening at Lord Ashton's estate? You spoke so passionately about your father's legacy. I have never forgotten how deeply you feel things therein. It is a quality most men lack entirely." The words were designed as a key to a lock Venetia had once picked open. She expected them to reach him. Theron's jaw tightened, his eyes moved involuntarily toward Evelina, who sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, her fork resting untouched beside her plate. She was not looking at Venetia. She was not looking at him. She was looking at nothing, with the expression of someone who had already decided they did not belong in the room. A sharp, unnamed feeling pulled through Theron's chest. "I remember that evening differently than you do, Lady Darrow," he said quietly, "and I would prefer not to revisit it." Venetia's smile flickered, but held. Ariel sipped her wine in silence, watching the exchange with satisfaction. Meanwhile, the gossip Oriel had carefully planted began bearing fruit. Through letters and whispered conversations with society women she trusted to be indiscreet, Oriel had seeded a narrative that spread across London drawing rooms. Within weeks, the Duke married beneath himself, out of legal necessity. The wife is unremarkable and entirely out of her depth. The true match for Cresswell has always been Venetia Darrow. It is only a matter of time. Venetia's campaign extended beyond proximity to Theron. She targeted Evelina directly with the precise, surgical cruelty of someone who understood that the deepest wounds required no raised voice. During an afternoon tea in the drawing room, attended by several neighboring wives, Venetia turned the conversation casually toward marriages of convenience. "I have always believed," she began with measured elegance, "that arranged matches serve a practical purpose. They allow families to stabilize their finances without burdening the union with unrealistic expectations of affection." Several women nodded politely. Evelina continued, stirring her tea in silence. "Of course," Venetia added, glancing briefly toward Evelina with an expression of perfectly calibrated sympathy. "The difficulty arises when one party begins hoping for more than the arrangement was designed to provide. That is when hearts get broken unnecessarily." The room shifted uncomfortably. Every woman present understood the implication. Evelina set her teacup down with steady hands, smiled at the table, and excused herself to attend to household matters in the corridor afterward. She leaned against the wall and placed her palms flat on the cold stone. Her breathing remained even, her eyes remained dry, but something behind her composure trembled with the effort of holding itself together. She had endured dismissal from her father. She had endured indifference from her husband. She had endured mockery from Oriel for months, but Venetia's cruelty carried a different quality. It was designed not merely to humiliate, but to convince Evelina that hoping for anything more than the arrangement was foolish. That reaching for love made her pathetic rather than brave, and the most dangerous part was that somewhere beneath her exhaustion, a small voice, inside Evelina, had begun to believe it. The rumors reached Evelina through the cruelest possible channel. During a visit to the village church, The vicar's wife approached her with a sympathetic expression that carried more gossip than comfort. You must not listen to what people say, Your Grace. Marriages endure all manner of storms. Avelina smiled politely. I appreciate your kindness. But walking home through the frozen lanes afterward, she felt something familiar settle into her body. The same quiet resignation she had learned at 19, standing outside her father's locked study door while the only person who had ever truly seen her was driven away without a farewell. She had survived that silence. She would survive this one that evening. Avelina did not come to dinner. Theron noticed her empty chair immediately. He offered no comment during the meal, but his distraction was visible enough that even Venetia's carefully calibrated conversation could not hold his attention. After dessert, he excused himself and walked through the East Wing corridor until he reached Avelina's door. He raised his hand to knock, then stopped. Through the heavy oak, he heard something so faint he almost missed it entirely. The sound of a woman crying with her hand pressed against her mouth, trying desperately not to be heard. Theron stood outside that door for a very long time, his raised fist frozen inches from the wood. Then he lowered his hand slowly and walked away. But he did not return to the drawing room. He did not return to Venetia or Oriel, or the guests waiting with brandy and false laughter. Instead, he sat alone inside his dark study and stared at the cold fireplace until the candle on his desk burned down to nothing. The following morning, Theron entered the breakfast room earlier than usual and found Oriel and Benicia already seated together, speaking in low voices that stopped the moment he appeared. He poured tea without greeting either of them. Then he sat down and looked directly at his sister. When did you invite Lady Darrow to this house? Oriel stirred her tea with exaggerated calm. Several weeks ago, I thought you might enjoy reconnecting with an old friend. Theron studied her face. And the letters you sent to Lady Caswell and Mrs. Pemberton regarding my wife? Were those also for my enjoyment? Oriel's composure cracked almost invisibly. A tiny flinch at the edge of her mouth betrayed the surprise she was trying to conceal. I have no idea what you mean. Theron reached into his coat and placed a folded letter on the table. Mrs. Corwin intercepted this yesterday. You wrote it to Lady Caswell 3 weeks ago describing Avelina as a temporary inconvenience who would be removed from the household once the inheritance clause expired. Silence swallowed the room. Benicia set down her cup carefully, her eyes moving between the siblings with the sharp calculation of someone deciding whether to stay or leave. Oriel's chin lifted with defiance. I wrote what society already believes. You married a woman with no fortune, no standing, and no presence. She contributes nothing visible to this family. Theron's voice remained dangerously level. She organized every detail of your engagement dinner while you were fitted for gowns. She reorganized the kitchen accounts, saving this estate nearly £300 in wasted expenditure. Last quarter alone. She rescued 2 tenant families during a storm while you slept. She teaches the groundskeeper's son to read each afternoon without telling a single person. Oriel's face drained of color. She had not known about any of it, Theron continued. And now his voice carried the controlled edge of a man who had spent months failing to see something that had been directly before him. She mends linens beside Mrs. Hadley, so the old woman will not lose her position. She sits with Brinley when the girl is frightened. She walks the halls at midnight checking fires because she worries the East Wing servants will be cold. He paused. The room felt impossibly still. And she does all of it, without asking for recognition, without complaining, and without once telling me how badly this household has treated her. Including me. Venetia started to rise from her chair. Theron turned toward her before she could speak. Lady Darrow, you will leave this estate before noon? Whatever Oriel promised you about my availability, she was mistaken. I am not available. I have not been available since the day I married a woman I was too blind to deserve. Venetia's expression flattened into the same hard honesty he remembered from years earlier. She offered no parting words. She simply collected her gloves from the table and walked out of the room without looking back. Theron turned to Oriel once more. You are my sister, and I love you. But if you ever attempt to undermine or humiliate my wife again, you will leave this house permanently. That is not a warning. That is a certainty. Oriel stared at him with something she had never directed toward her brother before. Fear. Genuine, unperformed fear. She stood and left the room without another word. Theron remained seated at the table alone for several minutes. His tea had gone cold. His hands pressed flat against the wood on either side of his plate. Then he stood and walked toward the east wing. He found Avelina in the still room, sorting dried herbs into glass jars, with the quiet focus she applied to every invisible task she performed inside this house. Her hair was pinned simply. Her sleeves were rolled above her wrists. She looked up when he entered, and the surprise in her expression reminded him how rarely he had ever sought her out voluntarily. He stood in the doorway for several seconds, searching for the right words. A man who had once been mocked for speaking too honestly now found himself terrified of saying too little. "I heard you crying last night." Avelina's hands stopped moving. Her face became very still. "I stood outside your door and I did not knock," he continued. "I should have knocked. I should have knocked months ago." Avelina looked at him without speaking. Her eyes carried something he had never noticed before. Not anger, not sadness, something closer to exhaustion. The deep, bone-level weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime being unseen and had stopped expecting anything different. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked quietly. "Because you deserve someone who walks toward you instead of away, and I have been walking in the wrong direction since the day you arrived." The still room fell completely silent. Outside, a cold wind pressed against the narrow window while pale winter light fell across the stone floor between them. Avelina set down the jar she had been holding. Her fingers trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady. "I do not need your guilt, Theron. I need to know whether you see me. Not the arrangement, not the clause. Me." He held her gaze without flinching. "I see you, Avelina. I see you more clearly than I have seen anything in years. And it terrifies me." A single tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it quickly with the back of her hand. The gesture so practiced it broke something inside his chest. Then she nodded once slowly, without smiling. "That is a beginning," she said softly, "but beginnings require what comes after." She returned to the herbs without another word. Theron stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then turned and walked back through the corridor. But this time he left her door open behind him. Spring arrived at Creswell Manor, with the careful persistence of someone who had learned not to rush. Snow retreated from the moors in slow patches, while crocuses pushed through the frozen garden beds, and pale sunlight began lingering longer each afternoon above the estate's dark stone towers. Several weeks had passed since the morning Theron confronted Oriel and dismissed Venetia. During that time, the manor had transformed in ways no visitor could immediately identify. But every servant felt deeply. Theron began appearing at breakfast, not with correspondence or ledgers. Simply present, he asked Avelina about the gardens, the kitchen accounts, the tenant families recovering from the winter flooding. She answered, carefully at first, measuring each word as though testing the weight of ice before stepping forward, but slowly. Over weeks her responses grew longer, more detailed, more honest. He discovered she knew more about the estate's agricultural yields than his own manager. He discovered she had quietly negotiated lower prices with 3 London suppliers by writing letters under Mrs. Corwin's name, because she knew tradesmen would dismiss correspondence from a woman they considered unimportant. He discovered she played the cello, though she had not touched the instrument since arriving at the manor because no one had ever told her she was welcome to use the music room. He had a cello delivered from London without telling her. She found it one morning beside the music room window, with a single note resting against the case. "This room has been too quiet for too long." She played that evening for the first time in 12 years. The sound drifted through the corridors of Creswell Manor like something the house itself had been waiting to hear. 3 servants stopped working to listen. Mrs. Corwin stood motionless in the hallway with her hand pressed against her chest. Theron listened from his study with his eyes closed. The music carried something he recognized instantly. Grief, resilience, beauty that had survived being buried alive for more than a decade in April. The Northumberland Spring Ball was held at Hartfell House, the grandest estate in the county. It was the most important social event of the season, attended by over 200 guests from across England, including members of Parliament, titled families, military figures, and London's most influential society women. Evelina dressed quietly in her bedroom that evening. A new gown had arrived from London 2 weeks earlier, pale silver silk with delicate embroidery along the sleeves and hem. It had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation, though she noticed the fabric matched a swatch she had once admired briefly while sorting household linens from a London delivery. She stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at her was not the broken girl who had arrived at Cresswell Manor in a borrowed carriage 5 months earlier. Something had returned to her eyes, not the fierce fire of her 17-year-old self, something quieter, steadier, like embers that had survived a long winter and were beginning to remember warmth. The ballroom at Hartfell House blazed with 500 candles reflected across polished floors and mirrored walls. Crystal champagne flutes sparkled on silver trays carried between guests in gowns of emerald, sapphire, gold, and ivory. The scent of jasmine, warm bread, roasted duck, and expensive perfume filled every corner, while an orchestra played waltzes from a raised platform draped in white silk. Evelina entered beside Theron. For the first time since their marriage, they arrived together. The effect was immediate. Guests who had spent months hearing Oriel's carefully distributed rumors about the failing marriage now watched the Duke escort his wife through the ballroom with his hand resting gently against the small of her back. Whispers erupted in every direction across the room. Oriel stood beside the Marquess of Haverford with an expression that suggested she had swallowed something unpleasant. Lady Venetia was notably absent. During the evening, several guests approached Evelina with tentative curiosity. A baroness asked about the flood rescue. A member of Parliament's wife inquired about the estate improvements she had heard mentioned. For the first time in public, people spoke to Evelina as the Duchess of Cresswell rather than the invisible woman who happened to share the Duke's name. Then, midway through the evening, the orchestra paused between pieces. Lord Hartfell, the elderly host, stood and invited distinguished guests to offer toasts. Several men rose in turn, praising politics, prosperity, and the coming season. Then Theron stood. The ballroom quieted immediately. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the Duke of Cresswell, a man known across England for speaking rarely and feeling even less. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Evelina. 6 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, I married a woman I did not know and did not attempt to understand. I called our union an arrangement, and believe that word excused me from everything a marriage should require. Nobody moved. I was wrong. He paused. The silence in the room settled over every surface. My wife entered a household that gave her nothing. No welcome, no kindness, no acknowledgement, and she responded by giving everything she cared. For servants who were afraid, she protected workers who would have lost their positions. She organized celebrations without receiving a single word of thanks. She walked into a storm to save families she had never met while the rest of us slept behind locked doors. Evelina's hands trembled in her lap. Tears built silently along her lashes, though she did not allow them to fall. I spent months calling this woman an arrangement, Theron continued, and his voice shifted into something rawer and more exposed than anyone in the room had ever heard from him, while she quietly became the heart of every room she entered. Not through beauty, though she possesses it, not through status, though she has earned it, but through a kindness so steady and so unselfish that I did not recognize it until I nearly destroyed it. He turned fully toward her. Evelina, you taught me that silence is not emptiness, that endurance is not weakness, that the quietest person in any room can carry more strength than everyone else combined. His voice broke almost imperceptibly on the next words. I do not deserve you, but I am asking before everyone in this room for the chance to spend the rest of my life trying. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside rested a ring he had chosen himself. not the cold transactional band she had received during their legal ceremony in London. A ring of white gold, set with a single sapphire, surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight like scattered stars. The ballroom held its breath. Avelina looked at the ring, then she looked at Theron. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, though she did not wipe them away. She stood slowly. "You called me an arrangement," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion shaking through her body. "And I accepted it because I believed that was all I was worth." She paused. "I was wrong, too." She extended her hand. Theron slid the ring onto her finger while 200 guests watched in stunned silence. Then applause erupted across the ballroom with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers above them. From across the ballroom, the Dowager Duchess Seraphine Cresswell watched her son with tears moving silently down her face. She had spent years fearing he would die emotionally alone inside the walls of his own estate. Now she watched him standing before 200 people, offering his heart to the woman who had quietly saved it. The woman who asked for nothing, she whispered to herself, remembering the warning she had once given him beside a cold fireplace. And she smiled. Oriel lowered her eyes. Lord Pembury, standing near the back of the hall where he had arrived uninvited, turned and walked out through the service entrance without speaking to anyone, and Avelina stood beneath the candlelight, her hand resting inside her husband's for the first time since the day they had signed a contract neither of them had expected to outgrow. Years passed after the night at Hartfell House, and the story of the Duke of Cresswell's public declaration became one of those rare moments that society repeated so often it eventually softened into legend. Women whispered it during afternoon tea. Young girls romanticized it during daydreams about their own futures. Even men who considered sentiment beneath them admitted privately that the Duke had done something extraordinary that evening. But the true story of what followed was quieter than the ballroom spectacle, and far more meaningful. Avelina did not transform into a society darling, or a woman who suddenly craved the spotlight she had spent years avoiding. She remained exactly who she had always been. The difference was that now someone saw her clearly, and that changed everything. Cresswell Manor became a different place under her visible care. The tenant farms flourished after Avelina personally reviewed lease agreements and identified unfair terms that had been quietly exploiting families for over a decade. She established a small school in the village for workers' children, teaching, reading, and arithmetic herself on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, while Brinley, now promoted to her personal attendant, helped organize supplies and lessons. She reopened the Manor's East Wing Conservatory, which had been sealed since the late Duke's death, and filled it with plants she grew from seed. Servants gathered there during cold evenings, because Avelina insisted the warmest room in the house should not sit empty while people shivered in stone corridors. The Dowager Duchess Seraphine, who had observed everything from a careful distance since the beginning, finally allowed herself to stop watching and simply enjoy. She joined Avelina in the conservatory most afternoons now, sharing tea and conversation with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had always known her son needed someone exactly like this. Theron watched all of it with the expression of a man slowly learning to breathe after years of holding his breath. He did not become a different person overnight. The walls he had spent years constructing did not vanish simply because he had spoken honestly once inside a ballroom. Some evenings the old distance returned, and he retreated into silence, without explanation. But now Avelina knew the difference between silence chosen and silence imposed. She waited during those evenings without resentment, and he always returned. They played music together on Sunday nights. Her cello alongside his piano, filling the manor with harmonies that servants stopped to listen to through closed doors. Sometimes the music carried grief. Sometimes it carried something closer to joy. Most often it carried the complicated, imperfect sound of two wounded people learning to trust the same room. Meanwhile, the lives that had orbited around Avelina's suffering unraveled with the slow inevitability of threads pulled from poorly stitched fabric. Oriel's engagement to the Marquess of Haverford collapsed 6 months after the spring ball. Dresden had gradually discovered the depth of Oriel's cruelty toward Avelina, through conversations with servants who no longer felt obligated to protect their former mistress's reputation. The final blow came when he learned about the letters Oriel had sent to London society deliberately undermining her brother's wife. Dresden ended the engagement quietly but permanently, telling Oriel simply that he could not build a marriage with someone who destroyed others to maintain her own importance. Oriel retreated from society almost entirely afterward. The confidence she had carried like inherited jewelry revealed itself as something far more fragile once the audience she had cultivated began turning away. Lady Venetia Darrow's reputation suffered its own quiet collapse. The story of how she had shared Theron's private grief as social entertainment resurfaced in London drawing rooms with renewed interest after his public declaration at Hartwell House. Society, which had once laughed along with the gossip, now recoiled from the woman who had provided it. Venetia found herself increasingly uninvited, her charm recognized at last as the instrument of manipulation. Lord Gareth Pembury's debts finally consumed him entirely 2 years after the marriage. The money Theron had provided satisfied only the most immediate creditors, while Gareth's continued gambling created new ones faster than old ones could be cleared. The Pembury estate was seized. Evelina's younger sisters scattered to relatives willing to take them. Gareth himself disappeared to the continent carrying nothing except the debts he could not outrun. Evelina received the news without visible emotion. She sat quietly in the conservatory for a long while, staring at the plants growing steadily in their pots, while rain tapped against the glass ceiling above. Theron sat beside her without speaking. After a long silence, she turned toward him. "He called me the easiest to place," she said softly, "as though my willingness to be quiet made me convenient rather than kind." Theron took her hand carefully. "Your silence was never convenience, Abelina. It was survival, and it was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed." One rainy afternoon, nearly 3 years after the marriage that was never meant to become real, a single carriage arrived at Cresswell Manor. Avelina recognized the Cresswell family crest on its door before it stopped. Oriel stepped out slowly. She wore a simple gray dress, no jewels, no elaborate hair arrangement, no trace of the polished armor she had once displayed before the world. Exhaustion lined her face. Her hands fidgeted constantly with the edges of her gloves. Avelina met her at the front entrance. Oriel could not look at her directly. For several painful seconds, she stood on the wet gravel searching for words that pride had spent years preventing her from finding. "I was cruel to you," she finally said. Her voice was hoarse and unsteady. "Not because you deserved it. Because your goodness made me feel smaller, and I did not know how to bear it." Avelina studied her sister-in-law quietly. Rain dripped from the portico above them, while the manor's stone walls rose behind her like a monument to everything that had changed. Then Avelina stepped forward and took Oriel's trembling hands. "Come inside," she said gently. "You must be cold." Because in the end, the woman who had been called an arrangement, dismissed as a clause, mocked as invisible, and traded like currency by her own father, proved something that no contract, no title, and no fortune could ever rechuck it. That the quietest voice in any room can carry the greatest strength. That kindness offered without expectation becomes the most powerful force in any household. And that real love is never found in grand gestures or public declarations alone, but in a steady, unnoticed devotion of someone who chooses to care even when no one is watching. Cresswell Manor learned it slowly. England whispered it for years, and Avelina, the woman whose silence once filled every room with absence, filled them at last with something far more enduring. Presence, purpose, and a grace that no arrangement could contain.